Welcome back. You're watching Primetime with Anis Faruqi on Tech TV. Now we're going to talk about some issues in Myanmar, genocide of Rohingya community, and joining us on the phone would be Honorable Member Parliament of Canada, Garnett Genuis, who's from the Sherwood Park riding of Saskatchewan, very vocal on human rights violation in the House of Commons. And also we have Mr. Tahir Aslam Gora, the CEO of the Tech TV. Welcome both of you gentlemen.
Great to be with you today. Thank you so much.
Pleasure. Okay, we have heard that you this genocide of Myanmar in Myanmar for the Rohingya community, and you've been very vocal on that, and we would like to shed you some light on it and also bring some knowledge to our viewers. Let's start with you, and what do you have to say about that?
Sure. Well, the important step taken today, the House of Commons finally unanimously recognized that crimes committed against the Rohingya people in Burma or Myanmar constitute genocide.
Okay.
From my perspective, and from ours in the official opposition, Conservative, we've been calling this a genocide for a year. I first spoke of it in the House of Commons as a genocide in October of last year, and really, this is like a lot of cases like this. We see a recognition of these crimes happening far too late for us to have the impact on actually protecting innocent people that we would like to have. Nonetheless, it's a good step for the House of Commons to take, and we'll be continuing to call on the government to take more and stronger action to defend human rights. I'll tell your listeners and viewers as well that this is coming at a time when we're seeing an escalation of violence by the Burmese government against other minority groups in Burma. And there's, I think, a concern that the Burmese government will learn the wrong lessons from this genocide, namely that the lack of international response allowed them to get away with it so that they can do the same thing to other people groups in Burma. And that's the wrong lesson, and it's unfortunately the result of a lack of effective response from the international community.
Okay. Yeah. So do you think that Canada is rallying up the other allies on this issue internationally?
Well, I think it's too late, and I think it's taken us too long. But it seems that there's some positive steps now, and I certainly applaud the recognition of genocide that's come. But again, we would have been in a much stronger position if we had started going on this a number of years ago. I mean, I was first asking questions on this issue more than 2 years ago,
okay.
And that's when the escalation. This has been a process of delegitimization and dehumanization that's been going on for decades, but especially over the last couple of years, we've seen this dramatic escalation, and it's been terrible. But last fall, when this was really in the news, the government response was to appoint an envoy who didn't report until March. We need to find a way of reacting to these human rights disasters much faster so that we can actually not just be recognizing them after the fact, but having an impact on the situation in real time.
The reason I ask you this question because the international community has been tight-lipped, and we don't hear too much about these atrocities, and we don't even talk about who to blame. Would you like to tell us or our viewers who's the culprit behind all these massacres and genocide of these communities?
Well, I think there's a few points that need to be made there, and sometimes the government system of Burma is confusing, so it kind of obscures that responsibility. Burma has a power-sharing government. There's
right.
The military role, and there's also the civilian government. The military is most directly responsible for planning and carrying out this genocide, but the civilian government deserves some degree of responsibility here as well for in general, what they've said, what they haven't said, for participating through omission and commission in the delegitimization of the Rohingya, refusing to call them Rohingya, recognizing their identity as people that live in and are indigenous to Burma. So there's a responsibility for the civilian government as well, and we should mention as well the way in which China acts as kind of a supporter and an enabler of the Burmese regime. China, of course, terribly mistreating their own Muslim communities like Uyghurs and other faith communities, Christians, Falun Gong practitioners, Tibetan Buddhists, and so forth. So we see, unfortunately, that one of the implications of a rising China is that they provide cover for some of these terrible regimes like the Burmese regime.
Right.
So what does our response need to be? Well, we need to have a clear-sighted view of what's happening, of the way in which, for instance, the Chinese are exercising power. The Prime Minister once talked about having admiration for China's basic dictatorship, and that's a real problem. And yet we haven't seen very much at all from the government about Uyghurs. So there's a lot there that we could be doing better on in terms of pushing these issues forward.
Yeah, Mr. Gora, the part of the problem is that the voices are being silenced in these areas like Burma, China. The bloggers, the writers, the columnists, the human rights activists, civil society, they are not given their basic right of freedom of speech. Do you think that is also a part of the problem, where that world is not aware of this whole saga of this massacre and the genocide?
I agree with you, and I really appreciate Conservative Party's efforts to bring those issues on the surface. And just I would like to ask our very dear MP Garnett Genuis. So Garnett, what do you think? Is our Canadian government doing something enough to work for Rohingyas' rights?
Two great questions. So in terms of I'll answer the second one first. In terms of is the government doing enough? Certainly, it's taken them far too long, and I still think there are gaps in terms of our response. So up until this summer, the government had only imposed new sanctions against one person. And they still have yet to impose new sanctions against Min Aung Hlaing, the commander-in-chief of the Burmese Armed Forces. The tool we have in place now here in Canada is something called Magnitsky sanctions, which allow you to impose targeted sanctions against human rights abusers. So in the past, people thought of economic sanctions as being you can't do business with the whole country, and maybe that has a negative impact for just people that aren't connected to politics at all in that country. But we have these targeted Magnitsky sanctions that specifically sanction individuals involved in human rights abuses. Until this summer, there was only one extra person who'd been added to that sanctions list in Burma. Now there were additional people added to that list in the summer, which was a positive step. But even things like there was no mention of the situation affecting the Rohingya at the Prime Minister's speech at the UN last year. Canada could be doing much more, and the fact that we waited until last fall to appoint a special envoy, the special envoy appointed months late, and then it took months more for a response. And even there, I mean, a lot of their response from the government has focused on talking about development assistance to Rohingya refugees. Now that's a good thing, but what is most critical is that we emphasize a political response that isolates Burma's government, that sanctions people, that holds those responsible accountable, and that establishes a system of real deterrence so that the innocent, in this case and in the future, are protected. Now, to the question of, just one more point on that, I would say is this is part of what we see as a principled foreign policy, that our priority should be advancing Canadian values, should be recognizing here in Canada we're blessed to have a system of pluralism and minority rights. A principled foreign policy says we need to be true to ourselves and always stand up for the same principles, pluralism, minority rights around the world. We need to have the courage to do that, even if some other countries aren't going to like it. Now, on the issue of journalists and
activists,
people not being able to talk about these issues, there's kind of a chicken and egg thing here, right? What comes first, the repression of minorities or the repression of journalists and free opinion? They tend to go together. Obviously, it's the same kind of repressive governments that are doing the same kinds of things. But yeah, I mean, the lack of international access for reporters to the Rakhine State in Burma to actually be able to report on what was going on was a big part of the problem. On the other hand, we still had things like satellite imagery showing the destruction of villages.
Exactly.
So technology makes it easier to still get some information out.
Yeah, it is an irony that we are talking about right of freedom of speech, but we have on our hand a right to live issue in this community, which they are not given. Is there any other question you want to ask?
Yeah, I would like to ask MP Genuis about what India takes stand on Rohingya issue, because India is a relatively neutral country in the region, and India has concern about Rohingya genocide, but on the other hand, India has also concern about Islamist involvement, and especially from Pakistan's ISI's indirect involvement in terms of provoking Islamist elements in that thing. So, is Canadian government, our Conservative Party, both aware of this factor as well?
Certainly, we're tracking all of the sort of complexity of the different relationships that exist around the region, and you know, we generally take the position that when it comes to India, we want to have a constructive relationship, constructive dialogue about areas where we may disagree. Certainly, a constructive dialogue about human rights issues and trying to work together on those whenever possible. I would say this about the sort of the underlying point there about sort of so-called Islamist extremism and how that you know, countries that may have a concern about that. It is you know, it's quite clear that this is a one-sided repression of the overwhelmingly peaceful Rohingya people by the Burmese government, and the same is true in other cases. But then when you have these brutal repressions of Muslim minority populations, and these governments trying to say somehow that these people are terrorists, well, that certainly can provoke a response from people who maybe start out wondering if they should fight for their rights, and then maybe there's a risk that they get kind of drawn into other manifestations of opposition to the government. But it is this brutal violence against minorities that creates the condition where people are more and more desperate. So anybody who's concerned about the rise of violent extremism should start from a place of emphasizing humanism and pluralism in these contexts as being the solution.
Well, thank you so much for joining us, Member of Parliament from Saskatchewan. Garnett Genuis was talking from Parliament Hill. We'll take a quick break and we'll be right back and continue our program.